Wake up, southeastern North Carolina. It's time to get back to Curtis Wright on the beat on 106.7 My Talker Radio.
Sun's up across southeastern North Carolina, 7:35. Not sure how long it's going to last. They're saying that thunderstorms are going to be rolling in and severe later in the week, so you watch yourselves out there. Keep it tuned here on the new 106.7 FM, My Talker Radio. What a beautiful, beautiful weekend. I hope you all had a great weekend and are safe out there. Again, just to kind of give you an update, and if you're watching other news sources, national that is, that I think the number is up to 17 folks have been killed in the tornadoes that went across the central and southern parts of the United States, Arkansas in particular, half-mile wide to 3.5 miles wide. Unbelievable, the destruction. Again, the number's up to 17, I believe, this morning coming off the wires, and we'll keep you up to date on what we see on one of our screens here. In studio with us, back to North Carolina politics, is Representative Chris Millis. And good morning, sir.
Good morning, Curtis.
Well, a great announcement coming out that the committee that has been studying Common Core has now come to a conclusion here. I don't quite how you can explain to us how this works. The announcement was that legislation has been introduced to eliminate Common Core in North Carolina. Not quite sure how that works when the legislative bodies aren't in session, but you can explain that to us. Today is a great day for education in North Carolina, said Lieutenant Governor Dan Forest. The General Assembly listened to the voices of thousands of parents, teachers, administrators, and concerned citizens about the issues with Common Core. And I would like to thank the senators and representatives who had the courage to do what is right for our children and our state in the face of opposition. Your perspective?
It's good news, very good news. In regard to taking a very objective view of 3 years ago of how our state came to the place of actually implementing Common Core, this study should have been done 3 years ago, Curtis. Unfortunately, it was not, and it was pass measures and ask questions later, especially whenever federal funding was tied to the situation. But I'm very grateful. In the last legislative long session, this study was actually commissioned, and this study went forward through this interim. And to actually describe to you the way the process works is that at the end of the study, the actual committee prepares a report, and within that report was embedded this legislation to actually replace the standards of Common Core with standards implemented by the state of North Carolina.
But does that mean that because legislators sit on the committee, then automatically it's considered a piece of legislation being submitted?
That's right. That legislation is submitted as a part of that report from that committee. Okay. So what will happen is in the short session, if that legislation comes to the floor, that will be the legislation that was proposed by the committee to study Common Core standards. Now,
do we have any kind of, scoop from the street? We have Speaker Tillis that has to bring it to the floor, and we have Senate Pro Tem Phil Berger. Are we hearing they actually will do something with this?
It's uncertain, but I'll tell you this, the time between last Thursday and all the way until the end of the short session, it is imperative that the grassroots and those who are informed, and of course those who are not informed, I encourage them to do so, about how Common Core standards came into play, what they truly are, and the need really to actually have sovereignty by our state to establish our own standards and to truly have control over those. So again, it really is up to the grassroots now to put the fire underneath the rear end of their elected officials to actually make this happen legislatively.
Now, I know it's a wonderful weekend, beautiful weather. Folks are getting back to work, getting up this morning, and the last thing they need is Curtis Wright being so overly critical and negative. Here's the deal. Number one, Common Core will be removed from existing general statute. Now, I have spoken to several legislators, and I said to them, well, I don't understand how it even got into law and why it's still in law. And they would go, what do you mean law? What do you mean law? And I said, it's part of statute. What do you mean? So I'm really confused on that, number one, because the Republican leadership, the Republican Party, ran on how bad Common Core was, okay? So why wouldn't 99.9% of our legislators know that is actually law. It's in statute. That's what it means. Number two, my concern on the other side is that I bet you if I put a gun, pulled the trigger back, pulled the hammer back, and had my finger on the trigger and said, okay, I want you to give me an overview of Common Core right now, 3.5 years later, or I'm going to pull the trigger, I'd have dozens and dozens of dead legislators on the floor. They still don't know what's in it, and I'm talking about Republicans. So, say something to me that encourages me that they're going to do. I actually saw an argument about, oh, no, Common Core doesn't, and there's actually an ad running, the Common Core doesn't dictate what the curriculum is. It doesn't dictate this. It doesn't dictate that. Yes, it does, because if you don't follow 85% of it, you don't get the money, right?
Well, also, too, that's something we spoke about in the past is that, while that Common Core is the standard, they always say, they meaning the actual educational establishment that is actually pushing and promoting this above and beyond the sovereignty of individuals, is that they say that, well, just because it's a part of the actual standard, it doesn't dictate the curriculum. But whenever every test that is generated to make sure that you're actually, meeting the aspects of the standards, therefore it, inadvertently or indirectly dictates the curriculum as well. So it's just one of those things where there's a lot of deception about it. But in regard to your comments about legislators being unaware about Common Core, I can attest that is true. The encouraging thing that I would tell you is that Representative Pittman, as well as some others, were able to actually fight to get this study. Lieutenant Governor Dan Forrest was instrumental in actually establishing this study, and there's actually some of those in the Senate as well that were actually behind this. So the encouraging part is that the legislative will was there to establish the study. The study went forward. It was handled very professionally. I went to a couple of those, and I actually listened in on the other two, handled very well, and of course this report rolling out. So while it should have been done 3 years ago, I'm definitely thankful there's at least individuals up in the General Assembly with at least enough principle and fortitude to actually make this proposal before. So now, Curtis, it begins now with the rest of the legislators, both on the Senate and the House side, to get on board, and will this move to the chambers?
There's something here in this issue that relates to illegal immigration, that when the tough decisions weren't to be made, or, and in fact, there were some decisions made and led by Speaker Tom Tillis that destroyed and gutted our E-Verify, that study committee was a joke. I'm sorry. Frank Eiler's committee is a joke. Interesting that Frank Eiler is a big proponent for the re-election, for the election of Tom Tillis to Senate. But lest I digress. So here we go, and we see one side, and we saw where it went. Now, on the other side, we see Common Core. And in comes Dan Forrest, our lieutenant governor, and he makes sure that he's not interjects. He's a North Carolina leader. He's a North Carolina citizen, and he's there to advocate, and inspires, I believe, this committee of Republicans and leaders. And look what comes out of it. Where was the leadership on the immigration issue to make sure, instead of that committee being a joke, Frank Eiler's committee was a joke? Everybody knows it was a joke. It was window dressing. Where's the real? It's sad that we don't have the leadership. Now, what scares me, the reason I'm saying that, Chris, is this. We have a governor that's in support of Common Core as early as 4 or 5 months ago. So how is this going to play out?
It's going to be very interesting, but I'll actually say something, and I'm glad you brought up the actual contrast with Lieutenant Governor Dan Forrest. And this is what I truly believe. Unlike a lot of elected officials who's really almost a wind vane of seeing where the political winds are blowing and then getting onto it, getting a few talking points and talking about it, he truly has a heart for this. He truly stands on principle about it, and he more than once articulated the very, very truth about Common Core, and I think that's what made it successful. He actually believes in it, and he actually is leading on it versus just trying to use it for political posturing.
Amen. Yeah, and by the way, along the way, educating everyone exactly what the real facts were about Common Core, and that's why he was a zealous advocate against it.
Well
stay with us. We'll be right back with Representative Chris Millis. There's lots more to talk about here on The Beat.
It's showtime!
It's time to get up.
It sounds like a great idea.
Curtis Wright is on The Beat, the new 106.7 My Talker Radio.
We're back live here on The Beat with Representative Chris Millis from southeastern North Carolina, home of the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. The University of North Carolina is dedicated to the transmission and advancement of knowledge and understanding. Academic freedom is essential to the achievement of these purposes. The university, therefore, supports and encourages freedom of inquiry for faculty members and students. And to that end, they responsibly must pursue these goals through teaching, learning, research, discussion, publication, free from external or internal restraints that would unreasonably restrict their academic endeavors. That's right from the policy of UNC, not only North Carolina, but the University of North Carolina across the state, our public university system. And Representative, the reason that Professor Adams was punished was because he was doing exactly what was in here, okay? And I had the letter in front of me this morning from the chancellor in response to this case, which, by the way, they're going to appeal, well, as of right now. And it doesn't make sense to me. What makes sense to me would be that we have heard from the courts, but, well, let me back up. What would make sense to me is that when this new chancellor came on and new members of the Board of Trustees came on, they would have said, today we're going to vote and we are going to drop this lawsuit and we are going to make things right and we're going to live up to these, wonderful flowery words here in this policy. We're going to put our money where our mouth is. So then he wins the case, Dr. Adams, and the chancellor's letter infers that the university was still right and we're going to appeal it. Now, I don't understand. Senator Tom Goolsbee has made his feelings known that immediately the appeal should be dropped and the university should move on and live up to the ideals that are espoused in its policies. I don't get this. I don't get where no Republican Party, no Republican leadership, no one is commenting. This is a huge case. And especially, as you know, we've been on the campaign trail for how many years now, listening to Republicans run for office going, we got to get to those university campuses. We got to get to those colleges. They're indoctrinating our kids. It's unfair what goes on. There's prejudice and bias. Here's your opportunity to stand up and say, this public university needs to immediately drop this case, live up to its ideals that are espoused in its policies, period. End of story.
It's not like this thing was really swept under the rug. I mean, it made national news for a number of days. Not only, from what you articulated, but also, too, the overall Board of Governors really should, at least somebody within those ranks, especially after there was a number of them that were actually appointed this past session, appointed by supposedly, majority in the Senate, majority in the House, as well as governors, Manchin being in Republican control. So you think there would be at least one or two individuals out of there that actually had some voice. I haven't heard anything from them as well. So it's very interesting of what is really going on.
It's like missing, here's the opportunity. A picture's worth a million trillion words. I mean, right. This is it, man.
Yeah, it's a good opportunity to show the actual hypocrisy in what the left views as tolerance. And what their view of tolerance is that we'll tolerate anything that is aligned with our principles. But anything outside of our principles, we have no toleration for it. And
And I spoke this morning about we still have free speech zones. They're illegal. A federal court has spoken to that. Why are they still on our public school campuses? Now, I know I'm going to get criticized, Curtis. We can't fight, grab all, what is it? We can't skin all rabbits. How many years have I heard that? I thought we live in the age of multitasking. I mean, again, these kind of things need to be looked at on these college and university campuses. I would have thought that it would have been a priority, and everybody just keeps saying to me, well, Curtis, we'll get there little by little by little, Well, why? We have supermajorities now. Do the same thing. Look at these policies. Look what's going on. Put out something. Take care of it. Put an end to it. I think that the chancellor needs to resign because of his response. I think it's wrong. I think it sends the wrong message, and the message certainly isn't of tolerance or living up to the policy. I don't get it. I don't understand why Republicans miss the moment.
Well said. Well said.
Let's go on to another thing. On May 5th, thousands of people, they say, supporters of the film industry, are going to gather. And this is not going to be any different than Moral Monday. Well, actually, the Moral film series is now underway in several cities, just showing how despicable and stupid and ignorant and dumb the Republicans are in all their policies. And by the way, that's being funded by tax incentive dollars. Here we are, thousands of people are going to rally like the Moral Monday things, and they are all going to be rallying in support. And if I told you, if I took a gun down there and pulled the hammer back and went to every one of those thousands of people and said, explain to me how the tax credit work, I'm telling you 1% or less would know.
I agree. And I told you, Curtis, I told you this before, is that, of all the hate mail and or hate voicemails that I've received about my principled stance about uniform taxation for all, that whenever I actually explain to even individuals within the film industry of how the film tax credit truly works, that it's not that a production gets to forego 25% of its would-be state taxes, but that it gets 25 cents for every dollar it spends on lights, camera, action, labor, insurance premiums, the whole shebang.
And you said we give them a check, they get on a plane, and they go home to Hollywood. Now, the thing is that these folks will be rallying. Our mayor will be there. I'm sure that members like Susie Hamilton, probably even, Ted Davis, who's leading the charge to keep these in place. But yet comes back the legislative research group and says, well, even if we use the failed model of this professor, who, by the way, didn't disclose who he was being paid for, people had to dig that up, the film industry, it could be $30-some million of losses for taxpayers. Now they're saying if you really did the math, if you really, really did it right, it could be well over maybe $50-60 million we could lose a year on this.
That's correct. Again, you make some very important points out of that, is that when it all comes down to it, this study that was actually came out by a professor at NC State University, again, this is not a study by NC State University, but it's going to find out that the professor was paid directly by the actual film industry to produce the results, and it was not a study commissioned independently through the university. So you raise that point, and also, too, you raise a good point as well, is that it's not that the professor was saying that it's a $20 million gain, and the actual fiscal research says it's a negative $30 million loss. Is that fiscal research says exactly what you said, and that is, if you use the professor's model, it's his assumptions, and you just fix the errors, like the idea that the state doesn't collect property tax, and that the idea of it, that it really was over $60 million in credits claimed, and not, the fuzzy math of what was actually put before, that it's negative 30, and it's really, in truth, it's far worse.
Now, and this is a professor at NC State, Dr. Robert Hanfield, who based his report on false assumptions. And when before he published, those false assumptions about how our tax system works were brought to his attention. And by the way, he's teaching kids and he doesn't know this stuff. Okay, so they bring it to his attention, and his response was, too bad, and publishes it anyway.
That's right, and then that's the one thing to think about this. And when we talk about individuals stepping up within our university systems and being a voice against things that are wrong, again, I'm fine, Curtis, regardless of what the actual output of the model or the report may be, as long as it's based on truth. But whenever an individual within a profession is notified prior to publication they have blatant errors, and they publish it anyways whenever they're getting directly paid for it, to me, there's something within that field of
this
ethics.
Needs to be investigated.
Correct.
And lastly, my point was, so thousands of people will gather in Wilmington for a rally, and they are going to spew things that are absolutely false.
Yep.
And they don't care.
Yeah, and I say this, hopefully the elected officials that are going to speak at this film rally will actually use their own thoughts and ideas and not a script given to them by the film industry like they did in the past.
Right. A script given to them. Huh. Okay, Representative Chris Millis, thanks for being with us. Next is Hank Thomas, candidate on the Republican side for New Hanover County Commissioner. Stay with us. There's lots more to talk about.